And it kind of moves in a social direction, but it also is still very much dealing with how we negotiate these core faults of the heart, right? Because for Jesus, once we start making progress in terms of anger and contempt, in terms of distortions of desire, in terms of using speech rightly, what will still has the potential to derail us, right? To stall out our spiritual growth is pride. Okay, but that also has a lot to do with our social context, with the way that we, look at the people around us. In fact, in a very basic way, you could say pride is rooted in what we ended with last session, that impression management, the sideways glancing to see what other people think, right? So anyhow, so we're gonna focus on pride and humility for this session. When we talk about pride, what we're talking about is, I think, really the most toxic and the most debilitating or degenerative of all of our sins. And the reason is that it's the only sin that has built into it an inability to recognize itself, right? With all the other sins that Jesus talks about, those big three, if you're in the grip of it, you kind of know it, right? And so think of anger. And so you know it, and you can tell that in our culture we know it because there's even therapies, right, and programs and stuff like that to deal with each of these. And so with anger, there's even things like anger management therapy. Right? Why? Because people who are in the grip of anger, they know that it's ruining their life in some way. They may not be willing to let go. They might not know how to, all of that, but they know it's a problem, right? Or at least they're angry at you for knowing it. So if you talk about distorted desires, that other tip of the triangle, there's things like compulsive shopping disorders and stuff like that you can get therapy for. If you talk about speech sin, pathological lying, all of this, in any of these you can find therapies for it, right? Because people, when they're in the grip of it, they know something's wrong, right? I know of no clinic for the insufferably arrogant. Okay, Betty Ford, it would be a good development, right? I don't know of any place to go, any institution in our society that's set up to deal with arrogance, with the possible exception of marriage. So maybe that's what that's for. But the reason is that when I give myself over to pride, it has this blinding effect that keeps me from really seeing my own spiritual state, right, before the Father. And so what I want us to do in this session is really just ask kind of two questions. First of all, what is pride? Because I think, as with all of these, it's important to have some precision to know what exactly we're talking about, because the word can creep out and be applied to things that it doesn't belong to. Okay? So the first thing is, what is pride? And then once we get clear on what it is, we'll talk about how to move beyond it towards a life of humility. Okay? So the best place I know to really kind of bring to light the nature of pride is this parable that Jesus speaks in Luke chapter 18, verse The parable starts in verse 10, but we'll start in verse 9. So Luke 18, 9 through 14. And in a moment, I'll ask somebody to to read it. He doesn't actually use the word pride, but he shows us what it is. Okay, what it is. And so in the context here, you'll notice in verse 9, he's speaking to people who think they have found a way to achieve moral goodness on their own, and they're looking down on everybody else who they think has not made it. Okay? So it's rooted in a self-assessment of moral goodness that makes people think that they're better than those around them. So let's start there. Somebody read real nice and loud for us. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14.
To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Okay, thank you. All right. So he's addressing people that think that they've achieved some moral superiority on their own, right? And it's hard to get through. So what he does is he tells a story. He just says, let's look at what this is like. You got 2 characters in this story. One is a tax collector, which everybody knows means that person is going to be despised. You expect that person to be the villain, to be evil. Okay? Because, after all, it starts off as a betrayer, somebody who betrays his own people, a traitor to his own people. The other figure is a Pharisee. And because we've read the New Testament enough and we've been in church circles, our expectation when we hear that it's a Pharisee is that this is going to be a bad guy. Okay? But that's not the expectation that people in Jesus' world would have had. Okay? For most people in Jesus' world, the Pharisees are the good guys. Okay? They're the ones who are morally serious in a time when others are, well, we can kind of play with the rules to make things work with the Romans in town, right? They're the ones who are devout at a time when others have thought, well, this God hasn't helped out much, maybe we'll try other things, right? And they're very kind of public in their way of living, and that's going to be the downfall here. But at a time when not everybody was serious, okay? And so when people in Jesus' world hear that this man is a Pharisee, they would have expected on the front end that he's a good guy, okay? Now, the setting is the temple, and it's the hour of prayer. And so morning and evening, afternoon, right? Morning, evening, there is sacrifice, incense burned. And that's the time when people would gather in the temple, the open court, in order to pray. And so when you hear that it's time for prayer, what you should imagine is a large communal setting, okay, in the courtyard. And the idea is as the incense floats up to heaven, the prayers of the people come up with it. Okay? And everybody gathers, and when prayer takes place, it's out loud. Okay? So I know that, we have different experiences of prayer, and for some of us, silent prayer has become a very common thing. And that's good, that's fine. But that's not what would be assumed in this, right? When you hear that everybody's gathering to pray, everybody is going to be out there and everybody's going to be speaking out loud. So their voices go up to heaven as the incense rises to heaven. That's important because what happens is, as everybody gathers to pray, you have these two men who come in with them. One is a Pharisee and one is a tax collector. And what happens here is that we kind of zoom in. Jesus tells us about the Pharisee. And what we're told in verse 11 is that the Pharisee stood and he was praying. And you'll have one of two translations there. How many of you was praying to himself? Or by? Standing by himself. Okay, standing by himself. Good. All right. So the proper translation is that he stood by himself and prayed. This is about physical separation. Okay? And I'll just point out, all the way through Luke Acts, he has this way, the author has, of talking about internal thought, speaking to oneself. And it's got and you have it here at the, just up above in the, in verse 4, you have a different grammatical construction when the judge is speaking to himself than what you have here. So all that to say, it's clear that this passage, you should be reading it as the Pharisee stands apart. He stands away from the other people by himself. Now, to us that might not mean much, but in his world, it's sending a very clear signal. And the signal that he's sending is that he considers himself a holy man. Okay? And the idea is this: everybody's gathering, but you're supposed to have purified yourself to come into the temple. Okay? And the Pharisee, he's the one, actually even the word Pharisee, it comes from parashim, which means separatist in Hebrew. The Pharisee is the one who wants to make sure that all of the purity that is required by God has been maintained, but he doesn't trust that anybody else has done it properly. And so he'll pull out. He won't eat at other people's homes. He'll invite people to eat at his, but because then he can make sure they wash before they come in, right? And he can make sure that the foods are appropriate and all of that. But he won't eat in just anybody's house. Right? So there's that separate impulse. And what's happening here is, as people gather, they're gathering up in one place, but over by himself, to one side, you have the Pharisee standing. Why? He doesn't want to be polluted by the people. They're dirty. He can't trust that they've done what they're supposed to do. And so he stands by himself and then he prays. Right? And when he opens his mouth, we kind of get this x-ray of his heart. And this is where we really find out what pride is. Okay? Because notice what he does. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. And we just stop there for a second. Okay? I thank you that I'm not like that. That's giving words to what is the actual essence of pride. We just say what pride is. Pride is this illusion that my value comes from how I compare to another person, another human being. It's that comparison instinct, okay, or that need to compare that is what pride is. Okay? It's always kind of glancing sideways. How did he do? How did she do? Oh, I'm a little better than that. I'm a little worse than that person. Right? And always having to sort to find out where I am in a layer because I'm comparing. Right? It's that comparison itself that's pride. That's the essence of pride. Okay? And so he looks out, and as he speaks, he actually is just voicing pride. Right? I thank you that I'm not like these other people. And then what he does is he begins to describe what he thinks those other people are. And this is it's very telling, because what we do when we have this need to compare, where I'm only of value if I'm better than somebody else, is I start to come up with ways of comparing myself that make it more likely that I'm going to feel okay about myself, right? And so I have my own list of things to compare on, and they'll be different from what somebody else carries around, right? And so he says, I thank you that I'm not like these other people. And he assumes, now, and remember, he's speaking out loud, okay? He assumes all sorts of things about these people. Like, I doubt that he has all of their life histories before him, but like these people, they're swindlers, they're adulterers, they're unjust. And even this guy, the tax collector, right? And so he's kind of shaming other people, right? But he's also assuming the worst in the people around him. Okay, this kind of goes back to what we were seeing there, or talking about as the log in the eye, right? That need to compare and to find myself above somebody will drive me. It drives anybody who's given themselves to pride to assume the worst in other people. Okay. The other thing that happens is that, he's got a list that he offers in verse 12 of the reasons that he's superior. Okay? And this is, like I said, we start to kind of find comparison points, and they become individual, right? I decide certain things are really important, and so I'll compare with you on those things I feel like I'm pretty good at, but other things I'll forget about, okay? Because after all, you're better than me at that, so I don't want to think about that, right? And so he offers this list, and it's very instructive. He says, I fast twice a week, and I pay tithe, the 10%, right, out of everything that comes into my possession. If you look at that, it's worth just kind of thinking about it. So scripturally, we talk about fasting. So the two things that he uses to compare are fasting and tithing. Just in terms of the Bible, not in terms of later practices. How many times is one required to fast? Okay. In biblical terms, there's actually only one per year that's required for everybody, and that's the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement. Okay? Apart from that, there's good reasons to fast and all of that, but there's only one day that's actually required by God that everybody fast, and that's the Day of Atonement. Okay? But he says, I fast twice a week. Okay? In other words, he's doing extra things now, so he has something to compare himself with other people. Right? And the second one is he says, I tithe, I give the 10% out of everything that comes into my possession. And that's interesting also. If you go into contemporary sources in Jesus' day, if you look at the pronouncements of the rabbis, part of what you'll find, and I can photocopy this for you it's in the Mishnah, but is that there are certain things that the rabbis had decided you don't need to tithe. For instance, a lot of the things that grow in your garden, some of the smaller herbs, they say there's no need to tithe. So things like parsley and celery, I guess they just figured, even God doesn't like parsley, so you don't have to tithe it, But this guy, he says, everything, like every, little herb that grows in my garden, everything that comes in my possession, 10%, I separate it out. Why? Well, it's a show of a display of seriousness about God's rules in a context where that's something that other people will look up to, right? And will acknowledge. And so So he has this kind of list of reasons for being superior. And remember, this is all happening out loud, okay, in a setting that's communal. And so as he does it, he's also publicly shaming this tax collector. And so at this point then, as it were, the camera pulls out and refocuses over on the tax collector. Verse 13. And we find out that the tax collector, he also is standing by himself, but he's standing by himself for a different reason. Whereas the Pharisee is afraid that the crowd is going to make him dirty. And so he stands aside. The tax collector doesn't feel worthy to be in the crowd, and so he's standing to the side. Okay, he maybe is dirty, right? And he knows that he's sinful, that he's lived in wrong ways. And it's interesting, like his whole body registers truth. It just kind of speaks truth in this setting. It says that he was unwilling even to lift his eyes up to heaven, but he beat his chest, his breast, and said, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Okay. His heart again comes out in his words, just like the Pharisee's heart comes out in his words. Okay. He doesn't have any reasons that he offers to God when he asks for help. He has nothing but this request: please, mercy, please. And essentially, Jesus says, the hour passes, the service is over, everybody leaves from the temple, and one man, he's used that time to compare himself with other people and to shame one human being created in the image of God. And he goes home feeling pretty good about himself, but he's actually as far away from the Father as you can get. Right? But this tax collector who comes in with no reason that he should be accepted and just brings himself before the Father asking for mercy. No comparisons, just before the Father alone. It says he goes home and he's seen as right before the Father. He's justified while the other isn't. Okay? And then Jesus simply says, the one who humbles himself will be lifted up, but the one that lifts him up will be humbled. Okay? Lifts himself up will be humbled. Okay, so that's the heart of pride. That's the essence of it. Okay, it's that comparison itself. Part of what that means is that pride doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to feel good about myself. Because sometimes when I compare myself, I come out low. Okay, but that's still rooted in pride. Like pride is that comparative instinct or impulse, and the sense that my value is rooted in how I compare horizontally to other people, if I'm a little higher or a little lower than other human beings. And that's an illusion. Okay, what's the truth about your value and mine? Where does that derive from? Well, it doesn't come from how I compare morally or in terms of achievement or any, intellectually or anything else, right? To other people. My value comes from being created by and beloved of God. That's where my value comes from. Okay? And so at the heart of pride, of this kind of horizontal comparison, is actually a kind of illusion or deceit, where I try to think that of my value as something that I achieve by overcoming other people, by rising in relation to other people. Okay? Now, so that's what pride is. what I want us to do for a few minutes here now is to move beyond talking about pride and what's bad about it, and actually say there's a way that we can grow in humility, and try to be as practical as possible with that. And so, how does one grow in humility? Okay, apart from getting married, right? I think that I'm going to give you a few practical steps, but let me kind of name some assumptions, two assumptions that I think often block us from growing in humility. And if we don't fix these assumptions, then we're going to have a difficult time growing in humility. And the two assumptions are this. Very often, I think, people think that in order to be fully humble, I would have to be weak and I would have to be stupid. Okay? Now, we wouldn't typically say it that starkly, but that's really the idea that we have. You see, there's underneath this, there's this idea that if I were humble, I couldn't know it. Or at least I couldn't admit it. Right? And the reason is that we take humility and we try to put it back into that comparison instinct, and it doesn't work. But if I think of humility as something that prevents knowledge, that prevents truth, or at least truth about it, then that's destructive. It means I can't really grow in a good conscience towards humility. Okay? I was created with a desire for truth. Right? And so if I can't have truth and humility, why would I seek humility? Okay? And so that's part of why this is destructive. And it's also just false, because if you notice in Scripture, humility has a travel partner, if I can put it that way. Humility tends to travel with wisdom. Okay? And so the people who are known to have genuine understanding are marked by humility. And so this idea that having humility would prevent me from knowing it just can't be right. Okay? So it has to be possible to be humble and know that I'm humble. That doesn't make me proud. All right? Okay? The second element of this is this idea that if I were completely humble, I would be this kind of limp, weak, compliant person that could be pushed over at any time. Right? That it's impossible to be humble and strong. Okay, and again, that's a problem, because that's not a truthful opposition. Humility is not about weakness. Humility is about an acknowledgement of what power one has is given by God, and a gentleness in how one uses that power. Okay? And so there's no lack of power in humility. In fact, I think really in order to grow in humility, I had a student, dear lady, years and years ago in Croatia that helped me with this actually. She told me, she said, I never made progress in humility until I learned to think of humility as a power. And I started thinking about that, and it's quite true that humility is a power. Because a power means it gives you the capacity to do something. And I realized there were things in my life I was blocked from doing because of pride, because I thought myself above doing this kind of grunge work that put me in a position eventually that developed competence, right? And so there's a power in humility, and And it's interesting, you see this, if you go back through Scripture, you think of somebody like Moses, who is described as being, well, literally the most humble man on earth, right? So I want that on my name tag someday. But if you look at him, he's anything but a compliant, weak person, right? He's humble, because he's not trying to compare himself with anybody else. He lives, as it were, only before the face of the Father. But because of that, he's able to use incredible power from God. And so, I mean, he's the one when people oppose him, and meaning they're really opposing God because he's not doing anything for himself, the ground opens up and swallows them and things like this, right? That's anything but being kind of limp, weak, compliant, right? And so there's power in humility. Okay, so these are the two ideas we have to remove, okay? The idea that to be humble, I'd have to be weak or stupid, right? The truth is that as I become more humble, I'm getting smarter. And as I become more humble, I'm growing in power. Okay? Now, I know that messes with our categories. Fix the categories. Okay? So then how practically do we go about growing in humility? I'm going to offer kind of 3 little rules of thumb, but I want to state the principle behind all 3 of them to start with. And the principle is simply this: anything that enables me to steadily, consistently see myself and others before God alone will help me grow in humility. Okay? Anything that places me before the Father alone will have a tendency to free me from pride, because the heart of pride, kind of the backbone of it, is this comparison, right? And so 3 kind of practical things we can do, right, to grow in humility, and these are alliterated in English, so it makes it easy. So never pretend, never presume, never push. Okay, we'll say a word about each of those. Never pretend. Like I said, the essence of pride is comparison, and a very common response to that kind of sideways glancing and sizing up is to try to look like something other than what I know I am, right? And so one of the first things we can do to grow in humility is to just stop pretending, stop trying to appear like anything other than we are to people around us. It's actually possible to live lives of quiet authenticity, to just kind of be who you are and be that no matter who's around, no matter who's looking. And that in and of itself will break the backbone of pride in many ways. So what do we stop pretending about? Well, we can stop pretending about being humble. We can start there, right? We can stop pretending about both the good things and the bad things that we do. Okay? You see, it's not humility to downplay what good you've done and you know you've done. If you deny it, then that's not genuine humility. That sometimes is just part of that game of pride. And so we can stop pretending about both the good things and the bad things we've done. We can stop pretending about what we know or don't know. Spending time in academic circles, the most commonly told lie at any university. It's like, yeah, I've read that. Yeah. Right? And why? Because there's kind of prestige attached to what you've processed, what you've read. Okay, and so just we can give up on trying to appear to know more than we do, and we can say when we do and when we don't know something. We can stop pretending about emotions, right? And sometimes, especially in religious settings, showing emotions, kind of trying to create certain emotions in worship settings, that can be done more for the effect on people around us, right? And we want to just give up on that. It's okay, right? Now, it's not just give up on trying to display emotions, but also hide them. Like either way, like you can just be whatever you are there. That's okay. So we can stop pretending in how we use words as well. Right? It's really, it's interesting to observe oneself for a while, how one uses words. Like how many words out of what you speak in a day are for helping other people interpret what you did. It's an interesting exercise to do. Don't do it every day because it'll make you depressed. But, but on occasion, it's an interesting exercise. And it's interesting even to notice how many times you explain to yourself things that you did when you're alone. Okay? Yeah, I heard you, Phil. So, no. No, seriously, we take a perfectly intelligent, normal, healthy individual who's alone in a room and, knocks something over, does something, and I'll say I'll find myself talking out loud to myself, explaining what just happened. What's behind that? It's this impulse to kind of adjust perceptions that can become so kind of thoroughgoing in our life that we even need to adjust our own perception, right? And so we can make an effort to stop using words that way. Just like, when I do something that shows I'm a knucklehead, y'all can say I'm a knucklehead, okay? And we'll just leave it there. And so that's, so never pretend, okay? Second, never presume. What I mean by that is give up on expecting any kind of special recognition or special treatment. Right? Part of what pride does is it tempts us to look at things that God has done through us as being kind of our claim to goodness and value, right? As being really our own in some kind of special way. And what happens is if we start to try to take ownership of things that God has done through us, then there's a tendency to expect honor in return, some special honor, some special recognition. And so one way you can know if there's presumption inside, if that's something there, is just kind of look what happens when you don't get your way. Okay? And if one of the thoughts that bubbles up is, how dare they, how dare she, he, whoever, right? Don't they know what I've done, how much I've given or whatever, right? That's presumption. Okay? That's that presumption. And it's interesting, Jesus teaches very directly about this kind of thing. When you're invited to a banquet, where do you go? You sit at the lower seat. Right? Why? Because it's the humble thing to do and you'll get right. No. It's just you don't presume. You don't presume. Right? When you've done everything you're told to do, what is it that you're to say?
I told you.
Yeah. Just an unworthy servant, done only what I was told. Right? Not because that's the humble thing to say, but because that's reality. Right? And so presumption. We don't pretend, and then we remove presumption from our life, and then finally, never push. And this goes back to that Matthew 7 that we looked at earlier. So we give up on trying to pressure people to do what we think ought to happen. And instead, what we do is we invite and we ask, and we accept when they say no, right? And that's very important. We actually just a week or so ago had a lesson here looking at Jesus' way of interacting with people on the pagan side of the Galilee over in the Decapolis. And it's really, really beautiful and interesting that when he goes over, his first interaction is with the demoniac, with Legion. But when the people then come out and they say, go away, guess what Jesus does? He goes. He doesn't say, wait, no, I got more to do. Sit down, you don't understand. Let me explain this to you more. He just goes. He doesn't push. And because of that, when he comes back to that region later, having left behind the man who was healed, guess what happens? There's a crowd out waiting for him, bringing those who are blind, deaf, lame, so he can heal, right? It turns out that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is not to push, but to defer, to accept what the other person is saying, and leave knowing that God isn't leaving. And so the effectiveness sometimes comes with a little time lag. But that's okay. A life of humility is one in which we give up on pushing. And when we do that, we can see the power of God at work that otherwise would be covered over by our own hands, okay? And so practically, we grow in humility when we move away from any kind of comparison, okay? Anything that brings me to see myself, the world, life, society before the Father alone will bring me, take me away from pride and into humility. And then practically, never pretend, never presume, never push. And that together will help us grow into a life of humility. Okay? All righty. Questions, comments, other than give me lunch?